The Battle of Trafalgar, the last great naval engagement in the Age of Sail, the battle that ended Napoleon's dreams of conquering his greatest foe. Britannia ruled the waves, and since he was unable to bring it under his boot, Napoleon opted for the continental system, a petty system of alliances aimed at crippling its economy via sanctions. It was this system that eventually drove the Grand Armée to invade Russia, and we all know how that little adventure ended up. England's industrial might allowed it to pull in America and possess a larger fleet than the next 10 powers combined. So when the Franco-Spanish fleets attempted to unite, Admiral Nelson was ordered to chase them down across the Atlantic and ensure it went nowhere except the bottom of the ocean. After the Atlantic wild chase, the fleet was spotted near Cadiz in an attempt to cross Gibraltar. So the one-armed hero shadowed its movements, making sure it was far enough from an Allied harbor before he made his move. But on the 21st of October 1805, his ships were spotted, and the Franco-Spanish fleet under Admiral Villeneuve attempted to escape back to Cadiz, despite their numerical superiority. Due to the skill of the recruits and the nature of the command, the fleet lost all cohesion and failed to form a line. Meanwhile, an anxious and eager Nelson broke with tradition and ordered his fleet to engage head-on, instead of the usual "let's line up and fire till one of us sinks" tactic of the day. I mean, if that's what you can even call a tactic. Despite the surprisingly slow winds, which turned the HMS Victory into a sitting duck, the British didn't just prevail, they annihilated the Franco-Spanish fleet and managed to capture the majority of their ships of the line. Nelson lost his life pulling off the maneuver, but in return, Napoleon lost his hope of ever planting a French flag on the Tower of London. But what if Trafalgar went the other way? Could a reverse Normandy ever be pulled off? If so, how far would Napoleon go? This video was sponsored by, well, you. Stick with me here. So, I have a lot of ideas for videos, and like 80% of them would just bomb on this channel. If I could just upload whatever and whenever I wanted, and it'd have no effect on the algorithm, I would do it. But sadly, that is not how this platform works. If less people watch your videos, YouTube just kills your channel. At the same time, I want these dumb videos to exist. Like, I had an idea imagining a world where the American buffalo just randomly respawned in America with their pre-19th century populations. Like, imagine that. Instead of there being just a few thousand bison today, one day, those vast herds just poof back into existence. Imagine how much that would devastate the modern United States. Millions of bison, enough to black out the prairie, just retaking the Midwest and plains. Would anyone care about this? I don't know. But I do know that there would be a section of the audience that would, and they deserve full production value for that too. That's something that can only really be done through Patreon. So yeah, this was a Patreon plug. But wait, there are so many unique videos on Patreon and now memberships that you've probably never seen. More niche topics, things that just wouldn't fly on the main channel. If that's something that sounds good to you, then, check it out. We got polls, you can vote for videos, it's pretty fun. Okay, back to the actual video. So this scenario won by a landslide in the previous community poll. And to do it justice, I called in my friend Emperor Tigerstar to help me try out something new. Instead of looking at the overall big picture and aftermath, let's seriously dig into this. Let's try a realistic, yet alternative, Napoleonic campaign. I'm talking boots on the ground, week by week, logistics, engagements, troop numbers, and defenses. That requires a lot of research. But luckily, many of you signed up for the Napoleon's Gambit Discord event and wrote a ton of wonderful essays that helped with this video. Special shout out to the top 3 writers on each side, who saved me a lot of time in the Napoleonic rabbit holes. Alright, so let's start at the point of divergence itself. How does the legendary admiral lose Trafalgar? Simple. Ever since ancient times, naval battles tend to be winner takes all, an all or nothing gambit where retreat is not really an option. You rarely see an engagement which ends up in a stalemate, and more often than not, experimental tactics like that of Nelson end in failure. What helped him here was the fact that the Franco-Spanish fleet failed to form a cohesive line. But what if in this timeline they did? Suddenly, the decision to advance on a numerically superior foe who could fire freebies at you while you advance turns into a horrible idea. Worst of all, Nelson led from the front, and he would be the first ship to sink, sending a wave of panic throughout the rest of the Royal Fleet's ships. From this point on, they could choose to either turn back, advance, or resort to traditional tactics a little too late. In all three of those scenarios, the British fleet is obliterated, with some ships even surrendering to the enemy. Instantly, Britain would lose its best admiral and half of its first-rate ships. But that doesn't mean London would fall the next day. So what would happen? Well, Jimmy, time to find out. The Battle of Trafalgar was fought just a day after Napoleon executed the Ulm maneuver on the 20th of October, 1805. But why is that memorable? Well, because 23,000 Austrians were captured, bringing the total number of prisoners to 60,000. Within a month, Napoleon captured Vienna, but all of this paled in comparison to what he was about to do in December. Despite what the recent movie by Ridley Scott would have you believe, Austerlitz was not fought over a frozen lake. In fact, most of that movie is Hollywood at its worst. Woof. What's so sad about that is this really was Napoleon's magnum opus, a battle in which his tactical genius decimated the combined Austro-Russian armies, and solidified himself as one of the best generals in history. He had many great victories before and after Austerlitz, but this was his masterpiece. The War of the Third Coalition was over, the Holy Roman Empire was dissolved, and Napoleon was free to finally look beyond the Channel. And now you'll finally get a chance, little guy. Ever since he got back from his campaign, Napoleon continued his postponed invasion. A year prior, he had selected 200,000 troops, stationing them at Boulogne, before he had to fight Austria. The drills would continue as supplies were stockpiled, and the fleet was being repaired. The French had a larger force, more experience, and used a meritocratic system which saw the best officers being promoted. Britain, on the other hand, followed a more traditional military chain of command, where men were promoted based on seniority. Thanks to the report made in 1805, we know the exact number of troops guarding the Isles. As you can see, it's not even close. I mean, sure, the equipment of the British was marginally better both in terms of firearms and artillery, and their dragoons were to be feared. But should the Grand Armée make its way onto the flat fields of England, the Brits are toast. Thing is, they already knew that. That's why they spend a fortune building up their defenses. The no-brainer targets like Portsmouth, Hastings, and Dover were all armed to the teeth. We're talking giant Mortello towers spread across the coast, medieval castles refitted into powerful strongholds like Cowes, Deal, and Sandgate, an intricate chain of signal towers capable of instantly warning London of upcoming attacks, ripped straight out of Lord of the Rings. Then finally, you have the Royal Military Canal near Hastings. In typical British fashion, instead of erecting a wall, they dug a massive canal, 60 feet wide and 9 feet deep. This created an extra line of defense. All of this was done in our timeline, despite the Trafalgar win. But here, as soon as Parliament hears of Nelson's demise, these projects are upscaled and finished early. But let's not forget the most important line of defense at King George's disposal, the English Channel itself. In normal circumstances, the voyage from Boulogne to Hastings is no more than 8 hours. However, making such a trip in the winter is pretty much insanity. I even found this barometric pressure data report dating all the way back to 1748. And let me tell ya, weather conditions around this time were bleak. Keep in mind that this only applies to the Channel itself, meaning that Britain was free to recall some of its fleet scattered across the empire. So for the next 6 months, both sides had time to prepare for the clash of the century. While waiting for the Channel waters to calm, Napoleon appointed two of his marshals on a side quest, Marshal Davout and Marshal Soult. Both of them had distinguished themselves at the Battle of Austerlitz, and unlike other commanders, were perfectly capable of leading an army on their own. Known for their aggressive and fast-paced tactics, they are the perfect choice to lead the Irish rebellion that was brewing. You see, if you didn't know, Ireland's never been the biggest fan of British rule, but with the last couple of years in particular, discontent grew into violence. The 1798 and 1803 rebellions in particular provided a window of opportunity for the French. And so on the 5th of March 1806, a portion of the French Armada makes its way to the western coast of Ireland and splits in two. This armada was made up of 102 transport ships carrying 10,000 French troops, alongside 4 battalions of the Irish League. They were escorted by 67 warships, mostly frigates and smaller ships of the line. Marshal Davout landed in Ballybunion, while Soult assaulted Kilkenny. The signal towers were triggered, but by the time the British were aware of the invasion, the relatively small expeditionary force was already on their shores. The British, who were busy training thousands of recruits, building ships, and fortifying England, were caught off guard. The Royal Navy was dispatched, and General Ormsby Vandeleur was ordered to repel the invaders. Within 2 weeks, the French advanced on Limerick and Galway, with the local populace rallying behind them. France had sent 1,000 men 8 years earlier, but these troops, and the renown of their marshals, had lit a spark, a hope, for a free Irish state. Both cities fell within days, and thanks to the location near the Golden Vale of Ireland, these two swift armies had enough provisions to last until the summer. By this point, Ormsby and the Navy were in position to challenge the French. The British force in Ireland prior to the invasion stood at 34,000 strong, with another 20,000 militia, but they were mostly garrisoned near Cork, Waterford, and Dublin. Ormsby had 26,000 men at his disposal, but he couldn't risk splitting his force as the French did. When given the dilemma on which front to focus on, he chose Galway, which would allow for supporting fire from the Royal Navy. But by the time he got there, Soult had already moved north, living off the land, and arming Irish rebels everywhere he went. This triggered a wave of panic, expressing itself in dozens of punitive raids against the Irish. Britain was more vulnerable than ever, and the traitors who sided with the French were hanged in the hundreds. Napoleon had started a guerrilla campaign in the British back door, forcing them to spend precious time and material chasing his two war dogs. At the end of March, Ormsby managed to capture an encrypted message. The text is relayed to codebreaks in Dublin, detailing Napoleon's orders to Davout to capture and hold Cork until late May, where the full invasion force would land. In 1806, our dear King George III was, well, let's just say mentally unstable. And despite his proclamations that if Napoleon lands in England he would meet him in battle, the real command is split between two men. General John Moore, the man who initiated the construction of the military canal and Martello Towers, and Prince Frederick, the Duke of York, a man mocked for his disastrous Flanders campaign. Since then, however, the Duke became commander-in-chief and learned from his mistakes, completely reorganizing and reforming the British Army. Upon breaking the message, Parliament immediately ordered them to prepare for the Irish invasion. Multiple squadrons were ordered to patrol the waters, and General David Dundas was transported directly to Cork at the head of 10,000 soldiers. Little did they know, this was all part of Napoleon's plan. While Soult continued to rampage through the Irish countryside, Davout prepared to lay siege to Cork. However, this was all just a ruse. On June 6th, another expeditionary force, this time 26,000 strong, sailed from Boulogne to Eastbourne. Upon arrival, the French flagship Bucentaure fired down a massive barrage on the city's defenses. Napoleon had called upon the assistance of the Spanish, Dutch, and even Danish fleets to assist him. This was the real deal. Napoleon himself descended upon the battered city with his best troops, and within 6 hours of him sailing from France, he was finally on English soil. Admiral Collingwood raced to the landing site and clashed with the French Navy. However, their strategy was only to hold the Royal Navy at bay, buying time and then retreating back towards Calais. In the meantime, Bonaparte sent out another one of his trusted commanders to take Hastings. Marshal Ney took 6,000 men and headed east, while the rest of the army headed west. Napoleon always liked to study a battlefield days before a battle, and he knew that the English would not give up Brighton without a significant resistance. By the time of the attack, the British regulars were now close to 80,000, a quarter of which were cavalry, which can quickly react to the breach. Yet most of the defenders were spread across a wide front, and nearly a third were back in Ireland. Brighton and Hastings were extremely well fortified, but the Duke of York knew they would always fail without reinforcements. Troops and ships from York were recalled, but before they could properly deploy, news arrived of another French drop. Hot air balloons were used to discover the movements of the Royal Navy, and several hours after it had passed by Dover, the French sprung into action. Marshal Murat and another 15,000 Frenchmen set sail from The Hague and landed at Great Yarmouth on June 18th. This flamboyant cavalry commander was given free rein from Napoleon to raid as much of the Norfolk flatlands as he wished. Instead of directly attacking Norwich, he galloped through the English countryside, opening a new front. With 5 separate armies roaming the Isles, where exactly would you tell your navy to go, if say you were the one in charge of the defense? Do you prevent more reinforcements to join up with Napoleon? Do you protect the crucial coastline cities? What about another attack on Ireland, the Channel Islands, Cornwall? As you can see, this would be a nightmare for the crown, but there was a glimmer of hope. Hastings was on the brink, and right as it was about to surrender, John Moore arrived with 23,000 soldiers. Using the range superiority of his artillery, as well as the Royal Horse Artillery, he was able to surround the 6,000 men led by Ney and obliterate them. The brave marshal fought until the end, but ultimately, he failed as emperor. Upon receiving news of this counterattack, Napoleon ordered his men to move against Brighton. The signal towers were lit, and the Royal Navy was ordered to assist the siege. And that is when the French Navy ferried yet another army into the fray. This time it was at Bernadotte, with 24,000 men who sailed from Calais to Ramsgate. Without a navy to resist him, the Marshal was able to take the landing and immediately marched against Dover Castle, taking a sandwich and a deal along the way. Lastly, the final hand Napoleon had to play was overwhelming the already stretched thin Royal Navy by sending not one, but 2 separate fleets transporting 10,000 men each from Brest. Britain had the capability to protect Cork, lay down supporting fire on Brighton, blockade the coast to prevent supplies from aiding the armies already in England, and prevent more armadas from sailing in, but it couldn't do all of that at the same time. So when the towers made their signal, only one of the fleets could be intercepted in time. Okay, pause. I was trying to analyze wind patterns and garrison sizes to figure out which would get intercepted, but screw it. Let's do a coin toss. Tails. While the fleet aiming for Weymouth does arrive at its destination, the one gunning for Milford is completely annihilated. In an attempt to cut off the head of the snake, the Duke of York rode out to meet Napoleon with an army twice his size, sealing the fate of Dover, which Bernadotte managed to take. Elsewhere, Murat and the Irish rebels made enormous gains, putting pressure on Parliament. The French landings made too many casualties, but luckily for them, a man by the name of Dominique Larrey was among them. The father of modern military medicine learned much during the previous campaigns, especially the one in Egypt, and his reforms made the French army leagues ahead of its competition. Disease prevention, bandaging, amputation, triage, ambulances, all contributed to something the rest of the world would adopt 50 years later. Despite being the attacker, Napoleon sustained 3 times fewer casualties as a result of these improvements and their experience. With Brighton under blockade and with an army fast approaching, Bonaparte took 15,000 men and occupied the hills to the east. In this fateful encounter, the Emperor fought the Duke at the Battle of Brighton, adding another masterpiece to his resume. The crucial moment of the battle was Marshal Lannes charging through the British right flank, breaking their lines. While the French artillery bombarded the center, Napoleon then made his way west and captured Portsmouth after a 2-week siege, while the rest of his generals secured the coastline all the way up to Dover. The Martello Towers were captured, and now with such a vast front, the French sailed through a single day and delivered 80,000 troops safely to England. The unstopping avalanche made its way to London, smashing everything in its path, loudly proclaiming that Napoleon was here, not as a conqueror, but a liberator, ready to strip the aristocracy down and finally give freedom to the people. No matter how much aid arrived from the Empire, London was doomed, and with it, its most important institutions, Parliament, the Bank of England, the headquarters of the East India Company, and all of Westminster. A vote was made, and rather than seeing it all burn to ash, envoys were sent to Napoleon to receive terms. Within a couple of months, Bonaparte became the unquestioned Emperor of Europe, and the French flag flew over the Tower of London. Similarly to his terms to Austria, he chose to be modest in his demands. Gibraltar was handed to the Spanish. Malta became French. A permanent French garrison was posted at Dover, and the majority of the British possessions in the Caribbean were given over to France. Ireland was given full independence, and the Australian penal colonies were transferred to Napoleon, who was fascinated by the new continent. But how long does this situation endure before the next coalition? What is the reaction of Prussia, Russia, and Jefferson's America? So, a brief recap in case you forgot. In this alternate timeline, Britain was invaded. Napoleon took London, the British surrendered, lost some colonies, including Ireland, and Napoleon got a garrison in Dover. Big whoop. Where's the grand strategy? The time-altering differences, the wacky map painting? Well, considering that a single garrison in Dover renders the English Channel and British Navy obsolete, Napoleon's arch-nemesis is no longer a threat. The Brits were his existential nightmare, around which he based most of his foreign policy. Who he became friends and enemies with largely depended on his goal of subduing the crown. That included some of his biggest mistakes, like the Continental System, Peninsular War, and invasion of Russia. But now, that fight was over. London was now within firing range if things ever got heated again. Despite this historic clash resonating throughout the centuries, had Napoleon actually won against the British, his terms would have been pretty lenient. He was always more focused on turning around and bullying the next major threat. What I love about Napoleonic alternate history is that this is one of the few moments in human history where global politics entirely depend on the mood of a few people. Like international conflict was determined on a whim. So hey, let's break down the irrational contradictions of the little corporal, shall we? While it's undeniable that Napoleon was one of the greatest military minds who ever lived, everything else was erratic at best. First off, despite being the flag bearer of the French Revolution and truly the man who spread nationalism all over Europe, he was ironically a staunch monarchist. Nepotism ran deep in Napoleon's veins. He gave every living relative a valuable kingdom. Napoleon appointed his 3 brothers as kings of Spain, Westphalia, and Holland, while his sisters became the duchesses of Gustavia, Naples, and Tuscany. More than anything, Napoleon's biggest dream was to build up a Napoleonic dynasty which dominated Europe, and he preserved rival dynasties like the Habsburgs in order to obtain its legitimacy. Despite often being depicted as the liberator of the Poles and Italians, he couldn't care less. Second misconception is the idea that the Napoleonic Code, which for the most part was a major step forward towards equal rights, spread like wildfire. Yeah, no. Turns out that fire really only spread to places where it didn't stir up too much trouble. When it came down to it, Napoleon preferred to keep the status quo in the occupied territories intact, for as long as the aristocracy paid their fair share in both goods and conscripts. Last, but not least, this guy was extremely dramatic. So, it's an alternate 1807. Britain has been humiliated at home and abroad. Instead of securing the Dutch South African colony, it's now just lost most of the Caribbean. Prussia was not annihilated yet, and outside of Russia, no one could rival France. 1807 in our timeline was arguably the peak of Napoleon's ascendancy, and especially popularity. Here we're talking about the birth of the world's first superpower. Unless you count Persia or Rome. France was so ahead here that even if you were to combine everyone in the globe against Napoleon, he would probably still come out ahead. That is, of course, if he played it cool. But this was Napoleon we're talking about. One might assume that a neutral Britain would mean that everyone would kind of just chill for a bit. But there were two major events that occurred right after Trafalgar that were pretty much inevitable: Austerlitz and the British invasion. First was the fate of Prussia. The Prussians were slow to respond to the War of the Third Coalition. But when the dust settled, they saw that there was no way they could exist in the world Napoleon was building. The HRE was a thing of the past, and the puppet state of Westphalia soon grew to dominate Germany. Napoleon didn't see Prussia as his equal, because to him, Prussia was like a kid who talks tough, but loses every fight. He promised them Hanover, then took it away. Goaded the king into the War of the Fourth Coalition. Not only that, but after a quick mobilization, the Prussians decided to go on the offensive with some Russian support. After another masterpiece in Jena, the French army could now scratch Berlin off its bucket list. The timings and locations of the battles here would be different here, but the outcome is exactly the same. Prussia can't afford to remain at peace, and nothing it could do would turn the tide. Maybe they attack while Napoleon is fighting in Britain, but it makes no difference. For centuries, Europe was a place where wars never stop. But you almost never saw the actual capitals fall into enemy hands. In less than 3 years, Napoleon could boast that he managed to conquer Vienna, London, and now Berlin. The peace treaty resembles the one in our timeline, with Prussia losing half its land and people, the Duchy of Warsaw being created, and the Russian Tsar, who was infatuated with Napoleon, switching over to his side. The second fate, which shifts regardless of the British and Prussian one, is that of Spain. Despite its massive size, the Spanish Empire was a joke. I mean, seriously, how could you plunder the New World of its golden land and be less relevant than Naples? Since the days of the Consulate, Spain was France's ally, even committing its fleet in the Battle of Trafalgar. Behind the scenes, all the decision-making was done by Manuel Godoy. While he was missing a crown, that didn't stop him from sleeping with the queen. The king was too busy bickering with his son. Talk about family dynamics. In our timeline, Godoy was given 3 promises in return for his support: Gibraltar, Jamaica, and Portugal. This was a necessity since pretty much everyone in Spain was opposed to fighting the Brits. Napoleon came short on the first 2, and when it was time to take Portugal, he was busy with Prussia. Godoy was outraged and mobilized the Spanish army in an attempt to attack France, as he issued the mobilization order on the day of the Battle of Jena. That's like Britain finally picking a side and declaring war on Germany after Poland was already— oh wait, never mind. That wasn't the best idea. In response, Napoleon sent an army pretending to invade Portugal, which, once it made its way into Spain, just started taking over the place. This whole debacle sparked the Peninsular War, which ended up costing 100 soldiers a day. There's a debate to this day whether Russia or Spain was the biggest reason France fell. Yet, in the Trafalgar victory timeline, Napoleon is never disappointed, and Godoy is never scorned. He gets Gibraltar and Jamaica from the British, and without British support, Portugal is the next to fall. Based on letters and diaries that survive, we know exactly how Portugal would have been partitioned. Its north goes to Spain, center to France, and south becomes a principality personally held by Godoy. Yeah, you want some cursed map gore? There you go. So what's the state of Europe? Well, Britain and Prussia just got steamrolled. Denmark is scared. Sweden is super scared. Austria is discombobulated. The Ottomans are sick as usual. And all the rest is under French control. All except, the big old bear in the room. So, it's 1808. Alexander I of Russia is 30 years old, and nearly a decade into his reign. He's an absolute ruler, sure, but a progressive one. He loved throwing around liberal rhetoric, pushed for minor social reforms, and actually made some big moves in education. His court? A battleground. Conservatives hated change. Reformers thought Russia was embarrassingly behind the times. They were right. On paper, Russia looked like a world power. In reality, though, it was stretched thin. Expansion eastward, the great game with Britain, and a stagnant feudal economy meant Russia was always busy, but never ready. Mobilization took forever, and by the time an army actually reached the front, it was exhausted. But here's the real contradiction. Russia's love-hate relationship with Napoleon. In our timeline, the two czars famously met on a raft in the middle of the Neman River in 1807, just after Napoleon deleted the Fourth Coalition. According to multiple sources, Alexander opened with, "Sir, I hate the English as much as you do." To which Napoleon replied, "So we have made peace." And just like that, they were besties. They spent the rest of the meeting carving up the world. Napoleon gave Alexander a little nudge toward Finland, even dangled the idea of slicing up the Ottoman Empire. By the end, Napoleon made 0 territorial demands on Russia, while annihilating Prussia. In return, Alexander shook hands, signed up for the continental system, and became a French ally. The next year, Russia took Finland. Napoleon annihilated the Fifth Coalition, with Russian backup. Napoleon wasn't universally loved in Russia. Shocking, I know. The aristocracy despised him. How dare a Corsican upstart with no blue blood play kingmaker? But others, massive fans. Admiral Chikagov, Minister of the Navy, pro-Napoleon. The Tsar's own brother, Grand Duke Constantine, obsessed. He met Napoleon at the Raft Summit too, and judging by how he later begged Alexander to not chase the French into their doom, he never stopped being a fanboy. As for Alexander, always the pragmatist, always in the middle. To him, France was the lesser evil, a necessary alliance, at least until Napoleon's enemies could recover and he could strengthen his army. So what changes in this 1808? Not much really. Britain's pacified, Prussia's crippled, Spain's in Napoleon's pocket. The balance of power in Europe? A joke. So what does Alexander do? Well, that's the million-ruble question. In our timeline, Napoleon spent those years desperately building a navy and getting sucked into the Spanish quagmire. Here, he gets none of that baggage. No peninsular war means he's free to do what he really wants. Honor the Franco-Russian alliance. And also, take another little adventure east. The contrast between the 15th century Ottomans and the one of Napoleon's time is baffling. Honestly, forget the sick man of Europe. At this point, just put the Sultan out of his misery. Since 1699, the Ottomans have been on a permanent losing streak, never expanding again. But the real cracks started showing when Napoleon casually rolled into Egypt in 1798. By 1804, Serbia was in open revolt. A year later, an ambitious Albanian commander, Mehmet Ali, took one look at how things were going and decided, you know what, I'll just take Egypt myself. He proceeded to rule it better than the Ottomans ever did, becoming the founder of modern Egypt. Meanwhile, back in Istanbul, which was still called Constantinople, the Sultan thought, hey, maybe I should do some reforms myself and modernize our Janissaries. The Janissaries had a better idea. How about we mutiny and put your cousin on the throne instead? And so, as the ultimate Romabu LARPers that they were, they pulled a Praetorian Guard move and installed Mustafa IV. Mustafa's first order of business? Execute the previous Sultan and parade his body around. But when his men went looking for his half-brother Mahmud, the guy activated stealth mode and hid in a bath furnace. Mustafa lasted a whole month before getting thrown out and replaced by Mahmud, who ruled for 31 years in our timeline. Not here. If you couldn't tell already, the Turks were a mess, and 1809 comes just a year since the double coup. The Ottomans were technically a French ally, but Napoleon's opinion of the Russians, coupled with his tendency to random bouts of betrayal, means that he could look at the situation and think to himself, why not? Egypt was his obsession. He loved what he saw there. In his mind, a French naval presence in the Eastern Mediterranean would be the perfect way to rival Britain. Grabbing Egypt, Syria, Cyprus, and Crete? That's how you tap into those sweet, sweet Indian trade routes, especially since there's no Suez Canal yet. And to add the olive on top, why not expand the Dalmatian possessions? Tour ancient Greece while we're at it. Wherever Napoleon went, his allies followed. Or, should I say, were dragged along. So without question, Godoy would be coerced into lending his fleet and army again, this time in exchange for some fresh North African colonies like Algiers. As for Russia, oh, this is Alexander's dream. Orthodox puppet states all over the Danube? Yes, please. Serbia was already up in arms and supported by him, while Napoleon helped in its suppression. A bit awkward. In this alternate timeline, Russia has every reason to turn Moldavia, Wallachia, Serbia, and even Bulgaria into satellite states. Basically, this is a match made in heaven, a perfect storm. The two biggest powers in the world against one fragmented, freshly double-couped empire. The year is 1810, and without Gibraltar, all Britain could really do is watch as fleets descend all over the Black and Mediterranean seas. The ships send troops and cannonballs. Napoleon sends a massive conscription wave through Italy, especially in Venice, and sails down the Nile one more time. Meanwhile, Alexander marches on Constantinople. Considering the fact that in our world, Britain rolled up with its navy, parked it by Constantinople, and started blasting in 1807, it's safe to assume that the Franco-Russian navies could easily do the same. The same goes for every major port. And as it happens, the majority of the Ottoman key cities were coastal. Here's the thing, both the bombardment and British invasion of Egypt failed. Plus, despite all of their faults, the Janissaries were still about 100,000 strong, with just as many irregulars. At the beginning, the Ottomans would get folded like a pancake, but logistics and disease would drag these two armies down just long enough for others to get some ideas. No matter how desperate things got, Austria held on to the gambler's mentality. Maybe this is the one. This time we take him down. 80% of Austrians give up on defeating Napoleon right before they win. In our timeline, this manifested itself into the Fifth Coalition, which was basically Austria versus Europe. And as expected, it lasted just a few months, before Vienna fell again. In this alternate timeline, the stakes are way higher. If the Little Caesar and Alexander get to complete their Ottoman partition, you can throw out the 7 great power system. Replace it with the 2 superpower system. Austria could always make the rallying call, but both Portugal and Prussia would still be reeling from their previous war. Not to mention that French troops were garrisoned in most Prussian cities according to the peace treaty, so no luck there. But then you have Britain. King George III first lost the Americas, and then London itself. So, just like in our timeline, he got replaced by his son, uniquely named George IV. the crown passed down from a mentally ill king to a naughty, drunk prince. Not like that really mattered anyway, because the real power was in the prime minister, who was senile and merely a figurehead. Huh. Alright, well that leaves power in the hands of one of the best orators in history. One who was overly ambitious and made some insane calls. Like that one time he decided to flatten Copenhagen because the Danish didn't give up all of their ships, killing 2,000 civilians. Britain's arm was already cut off, and Parliament was fully aware that Napoleon would soon find an excuse to finish the job. So, Dover garrison or not, this was the time to act. Still, there's something missing here. Or should I say, someone. Godoy was no friend of Napoleon. Like I mentioned earlier, he was ready to abandon their friendship at the drop of a hat. This guy was clever. He saw through Bonaparte's true intentions. Every favor came with strings attached, and at a time when Spain was extremely vulnerable, he, the Spanish court, and its people would love to be rid of the French dependence. After all, in 1811, both the Mexican War of Independence and Bolivar's war in Venezuela were kicking off. So Spain betrays the French, pulls back its forces, and joins the coalition. Resistance in Sicily and Sardinia is reignited, but the biggest betrayal of all is yet to come. Soon after Tilsit, Alexander figured Napoleon out. While the presumption was that they were equal, he berated and bullied the Tsar in what could only be described as racketeering. To some degree, I get it. The guy must have felt invincible after defeating every foe he ever faced. But that doesn't always work when it comes to diplomacy. In this alternate timeline, in 1811, we could see both Russia and Spain spontaneously pull out of the war against the Ottomans, all after hearing the Austrian rallying cry. Between their combined armies and the still incredibly powerful British Armada, maybe they could finally go back to the way things were. This is a sink-or-swim situation, one where the whole plan hinges on the first and most valuable objective being completed: keep Napoleon in Egypt. The second objective: retake Dover. In this alternate scenario, let's say that the French put a 50,000 strong garrison in Dover to prevent this exact thing from happening. Well, that force is now surrounded and cut off from the continent, while another large fleet crosses the Strait of Gibraltar to blockade Egypt. The third objective is for the combined Austro-Russian force to free Prussia and put it back into the fight. That would take some time, since Alexander has to completely reorganize his forces. To prevent his escape like last time, the British Navy arrives shortly after news reaches Bonaparte, and now he has no choice but to bunker down in the pyramids. I mean, he could try to fight a naval battle, but that's suicide. He could march through the Sinai, then the Levant, Anatolia, and the Balkans in a reverse crusade, but that's even more impossible. The fate of his empire rests entirely in the hands of his generals, and those were pretty good hands. We are talking about one of the best fighting forces to ever march on a battlefield. Well equipped, well led, well supplied, and with a ton of experience. The Dalmatian corridor, where forces were making their way into the Balkans, makes Vienna particularly vulnerable, and those Prussian garrisons were no pushovers either. Thanks to the Pyrenees, Spain's brittle army could only really open a front in southern Italy, which they would seriously struggle in. Lastly, you have Marshal Soult, an extremely loyal and great commander, particularly on the defensive. He was excellent when it came to logistics, and Britain's only hope is to starve him out or wait for him to make a bad move. The first couple of months in this war are key, and since we have like 10 fronts at the same time, anything could happen. Napoleon could get camp fever and die. Soult could charge in and take London. Hell, we could even see a timeline where Napoleon is slightly more reserved and doesn't sail to Egypt in the first place. Oh, who am I kidding? Of course he would do it. The one thing I could predict is that this Russo-Anglo-Spanish fleet probably couldn't maintain a double blockade for over a year, especially since the French still have a very formidable navy. Remember, in this scenario, Trafalgar is a success, And even when it wasn't in our timeline, Napoleon still kept building up a navy. So how would this play out? In my opinion, the Habsburgs are the weak link. They're gonna be the first to fall. From what we know, Napoleon is leading just one of 3 armies against the Ottomans. One with a goal of securing Egypt and the Levant. A second army could push through Dalmatia to take over the Western Balkans, while a third crosses the Adriatic to conquer Greece. The question here is who is leading armies 2 and 3, and who's in charge of the Prussian occupation? The last one is pretty easy. Marshal Bernadotte, top-tier commander, one who weirdly became the King of Sweden. The Swedish dynasty is French. For the Balkans, the man most suited for the job is André Massena. He had a reputation for boldness and ability in difficult terrain, making him an excellent choice to lead a campaign in, well, this. As for Greece, it's honestly a toss-up between Linné or Davout, but either way, you got some of the best commanders out there, with 50,000 elite troops each. With no peninsular war to drain that manpower pool or treasury, France could make that number go as high as 70,000, with a lot more in reserve. What makes this so fun is that the massive Russian army, led by General Suvorov, would be marching along the Danube towards a vulnerable Vienna. So this is going to be a showdown. 4 months into the waiting game, Napoleon and Soult hold out as their supplies start to dwindle. The 2nd and 3rd French armies are grouped together, but can't overtake the Austro-Russians led by Suvorov, while Bernadotte and a new massive army manage to take over Prague. What was supposed to be a quick knockout punch doesn't really land. And before the coalition can really make their move, they receive some bad news from the Americas. Bolivar in Venezuela, Hidalgo in Mexico, and Madison in the US of A. What I find particularly interesting about this scenario is how instead of taking a sharp turn from our reality, it kind of runs parallel to a lot of major events, a lot which were instigated before Trafalgar. Events in Constantinople, Madrid, Vienna, Latin America, and now, Washington. James Madison and the war hawks around him hated the British practice of literally kidnapping American sailors and forcing them into the Royal Navy. A process which here would be twice as bad since Britain lost a bunch of ships and desperately needed more. Both Jefferson and Madison started off liking Napoleon, but after he revealed himself to be a radical monarchist, they had some second thoughts. The French embargo of 1807 also soured things. But hey, the Louisiana Purchase more than made up for it. And while those in the White House were aware of Napoleon's true character, for everyone else, he was the guy who tore down a tyrannical regime which Adams fought a fake war with 6 years ago. The revolution was still fresh in people's minds, and between the British and the French, there was a clear crowd favorite. Now, in this alternate scenario, let's amp that up significantly. Because here, there's no embargo of 1807. Instead, it's most likely the British pirating and blockading trade between the Americans and the French. As the French ambassador in Paris, Jonathan Russell is the one to receive an offer which expedites the War of 1812 by a full year. The Warhawks, particularly in the South and West, didn't just want to end the practice of impressment, trade sanctions, and British support of the Native Americans. Oh no! There was a deep desire for manifest destiny in all directions. That included both Florida and Canada. Since France was fighting both the British and the Spanish and gave up on its colonial goals in North America, these are very much on the table. For Napoleon, Quebec was to be restored to the French Empire, alongside a few extra pieces of land. But the rest would be Madison's for the taking. Yes, I'm talking about America invading Canada, earlier this time. And in this world, the president is well aware that the Royal Navy is all over the place. They won't be able to reinforce Canada as much as they did in our timeline. France and its allies posed a minor threat, but a threat nonetheless in the Channel, North Sea, Caribbean, and Mediterranean. And remember, there's no Nelson here to save them either. So we have Andrew Jackson, Simón Bolívar, Miguel Hidalgo, and several top-tier marshals versus Suvorov, the Duke of Wellington, and some horrible allies with the Spanish, Austrians, and Ottomans. In this climax of the Napoleonic era, the grumpy man himself is impatiently building sandcastles in Egypt, waiting for his opening. But he won't have to wait for long. The year is 1811, and only 6 years have passed since Britain's catastrophic defeat at Trafalgar. Step by step, one reckless gamble after another, the world has been pushed to the brink. It's a powder keg, and Jimmy, when it blows, you're not gonna recognize the map that's left behind. Napoleon's empire, stitched together with nepotism, betrayal, and revolution, begins to unravel. A desperate coalition of Britain, Russia, Spain, and Austria plots to trap him in Egypt, retake Dover, and free Prussia. From North African corsairs to Indian princes, new fires spread across the seas, while in the Americas, Madison's warhawks eye Canada as Bolivar and Hidalgo tear at Spain's empire. Every front is ablaze. Kutuzov marches through the Balkans, Wellington braces in London, and Napoleon's marshals strain to hold it all together. Yet Napoleon's greatest enemy might not be a rival. It might be his own hubris. Napoleon's marshals hold Europe's fate, but his arrogance, coupled with famine, revolts, and a volcanic shadow looming in 1815, threatens complete collapse. In this climactic saga, one man's whims could redraw the world or burn it down. If we look at Napoleon's war record, the Little Corporal usually began his operations between spring to early summer. So, the co-op Ottoman invasion of 1811 would be no different. The continental system still bites, Russia included, strangling not only Britain's trade, but much of the global economy. Add to this the rising cries for independence in Latin America, and one truth becomes obvious. Napoleon's march eastward gave both his loudest enemies and his disillusioned friends their last best chance to stab the little Caesar in the back. By late autumn, after letters and whispered meetings, Spain and Britain finally shoved their chips to the center of the table and declare war. Britain's ships slip through Gibraltar after landing an army in Ireland. Spain recalls the recruits Napoleon had conscripted, ferries them home, and reseizes Sardinia and Sicily, while harassing French captains across the Mediterranean. Suddenly, the two navies that survived Trafalgar are shooting at each other, and French Portugal finds itself blockaded and battered. Napoleon is livid, but more than that, he's helpless. Blinded by ambition, he realizes for the first time that he is not invincible. Stranded in Alexandria, he sends desperate calls across Europe. This is no longer a war against Britain, but a holy struggle against treachery itself. And remember, the 19th century hasn't yet seen machine guns mow down charging cavalry. That's still a century away. War was brutal, yeah, but still wrapped in notions of honor and duty, which meant betrayal was not just strategy, it was blasphemy. Hundreds of thousands of conscripts rallied, not just in France, but in Italy, Poland, and the new holdings of Greece and Egypt. Napoleon offered autonomy where the coalition could not, just as he had already done in Poland, Switzerland, Ireland, Germany, and Dalmatia. Behind closed doors, every monarch wanted absolute power, but for the soldiers and peasants who bled for them, this was something else. The revolutionary new order versus the old, corrupt, feudal one. To add even more drama to the mix, 1811 is also the year of the Luddite riots. Skilled textile workers smashed the machines that threatened to starve them. Centuries-old crafts rendered worthless by gears and looms. With hammers in hand, they stormed factories, torched equipment, and clashed with soldiers sent to protect mill owners. For Britain's elite, it was treason punishable by death. For the workers, it was a desperate stand against a future that offered them no place. In a way, it was the 19th century version of today's anxiety over AI, except instead of ChatGPT taking your job, it was this thing. So, stakes. Let's zoom out of the map. Dozens of new frontiers and the sharpest military mind in Europe stuck on the bench. The opening move is clear. Ireland and the Mediterranean islands quickly fall, while Portugal and Dover are locked down under blockade. Pushing them head-on is possible, but the casualties would cripple any future campaigns. Within weeks, the coalition is joined by the usual suspects: southern Italy and Naples, the Habsburgs, Prussians, and Tyrol. Prussia technically could choose neutrality, but with 50,000 French troops garrisoned across its land, neutrality really just means keeping their head down. And then came the newcomers. Norway breaks from Denmark with British guarantees. The Hanseatic cities strangled by Napoleon's ban on cotton, silk, tea, coffee, and spices rise in fury. These weren't just tariffs. These were prohibitions. Goods 10 times cheaper through Britain were now illegal. Then there's the Pope, Napoleon's loudest and most unlikely enemy. Pius VII had once crowned him, but soon learned what friendship with the emperor really meant. By 1809, Rome is annexed, the papal lands are stripped, and the Pope himself is carted off like a criminal to Savona. By 1811, he is Napoleon's prisoner, cut off from his cardinals, a hostage more than a pontiff. For Catholics, this is beyond politics. This is sacrilege. Every sermon against the Antichrist in Paris fuels popular anger, turning the papacy into both a moral and spiritual banner for the coalition. But let's be clear here. The coalition isn't exactly unified either. Hungarians and Czechs despised the Austrians. The Irish, Welsh, and Scots disliked the English. Prussian reformers admired Napoleon's codex. Catalans and Moriscos resented Madrid, and Bolivar had already set South America ablaze. So yes, the coalition did have ships and armies, but Napoleon had something they didn't: loyal allies and a proven track record. His bravado, however costly, kept the conscription offices full. The rest of 1811 sees uprising flare and fade, armies mobilize, but no decisive battles or territorial flips. By the time winter falls, the Ottoman Empire is already being carved apart. After bloody clashes alongside the fortified Danube, Alexander of Russia sweeps toward Constantinople, transforming Moldavia, Wallachia, and Bulgaria into satellite states. Slavic volunteers swell his ranks, pick up weapons from the fallen. Serbian rebels rejoice. Greek secret societies no longer have to wait until 1821, but in Bosnia and Albania, Janissary garrisons are firmly dug in. In the Caucasus, Russian gains are minimal. Armies hunkered down, awaiting the Tsar's word. On paper, Alexander has no reason to betray Napoleon. He has just secured his Black Sea prize, and he styles himself as a chivalrous knight emperor. But beneath that honor is pragmatism. Napoleon treats him like a junior partner, strangling Russian trade with the continental system, and waves the Duchy of Warsaw like a dagger at Russian lands. For Alexander, betrayal isn't dishonor, it's a necessity, a chance to seize Constantinople, rally the Orthodox world, and prove Russia was no man's sidekick. So instead of crushing the Ottomans, Russia signs a peace, locks in their Balkan gains, and by the spring of 1812, they march west under Kutuzov to defend Vienna. Alexander himself rides home, raising a second army for Poland. The Russian bear, once Napoleon's partner, now rallies to the coalition, and across the Atlantic, a young eagle sharpens its claws. The United States under James Madison faced its own reckoning. Britain's navy prowled the seas, seizing American ships and dragging sailors into service. To Congress, it was humiliation. To the Warhawks, Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, it was destiny. They wanted Canada, Florida, native lands, and revenge. Napoleon's embargo had soured relations. but now he dangled promises of markets for cotton, French backing against Spain, and the chance to humble Britain. For the Republic, siding with France wasn't friendship, it was opportunity. In 1812, Britain had fewer than 10,000 regulars across all of Canada, smaller than some European corps. Most defense relied on shaky militias and Tecumseh's Confederacy, which often outfought Britain's own officers. Barely 5 to 6% of the British Army was stationed in North America. Only after Napoleon's defeat in 1814 did reinforcements boost to 12 to 15%. The Navy wasn't much better. Out of 600 to 700 ships, maybe 20 were in American waters in 1812. The rest were busy watching Napoleon. Only by 1814 did London actually send 100+ ships, which is how veterans finally arrived to burn Washington, D.C. But in this alternate world, London is gone. Dover flies the tricolor. Every veteran is hoarded for Europe. Canada's defense plan boils down to one desperate prayer. Please God, let Tecumseh carry the team. Spring 1812. The garrisons of Portugal and Dover run out of food. Tens of thousands of troops spill into the countryside, foraging for scraps and getting picked off pocket by pocket. They fight bravely, even ferociously, dragging many down with them. But their fate is sealed. Even with those 2 holes punched in the map, there are still a dizzying number of theaters in this ultimate all-in war. Canada, Mexico, South America, Germany, Poland, Austria, Italy, Egypt. That's a lot of action. And those are just the big ones. One of them is literally an entire continent with multiple sub-frontiers. Here's the problem. I can't go too in-depth with every single one of these and still cover the aftermath without creating another part. So instead, I'm gonna walk through the 3 most important fronts in detail and sum up the others. And hey, if you want an extended cut, I mean, there's always Patreon or be a YouTube member. Extra servings of alt history if people actually care. By 1812, French control over Portugal, England, and southern Italy had slipped. The ship sailed without its captain. Yet Napoleon's aura, dynasty, and iron chain of command kept the machine running. Yes, decisions were now decentralized, but so were the coalitions. French lines of communication split between Paris and Alexandria, while their enemies juggled London, Madrid, Vienna, and St. Petersburg. By this point, the 2 French armies in the Balkans, 125,000 strong, knew they couldn't beat the Russians or sustain themselves in the mountains. The question became, what to do with the Emperor's best troops? Option 1. March through Anatolia, over the scorched plains of Cilicia, across the Syrian desert, into Palestine to rescue Napoleon. Yeah, not happening. Option 2. Risk the sea route to Italy through the Adriatic Strait. But the strait is treacherous, now guarded by British and Spanish ships, with hostile Italians waiting on the far shore. Option 3. Trek through Dalmatia into the Alps, then either cross into Germany or strike into Austria to finish off the Habsburg dynasty. The coalition knew this was the only real play. By shadowing them along the Danube, Kutuzov's Russian host could bide its time and pounce at Vienna. Minor skirmishes erupt in Serbia, some villages siding with Russia, others serving as French resupply stops. Based on marching speeds and logistics, we can assume the French would take 146 days to reach Vienna, while the Russians would arrive 39 days earlier, and yes, I did do the math. The showdown at Vienna would pit Marshals Massena, Lannes, and Davout against Kutuzov and Archduke Charles. The odds? Well, let's say without Napoleon, them being outnumbered 3-1 and exhausted from their mountain trek, let's give the French maybe a 25% chance of success. Habsburg incompetence and Hungarian outrest can't outweigh a battle-hardened Russian army fresh from crushing the Janissaries in the Empire's strongest province. The French would bleed badly, and their defeat would secure Habsburg independence, all while threatening Italy, Westphalia, and Greece. This front is so decisive, I'm giving the coalition not 1, but 2 points. Kutuzov's defense was only half of the Russian battle plan. Offensively, the baton passed to another great commander, Prince Peter Bagration. And yeah, thanks for catching my earlier slip. Suvorov had actually been dead for 12 years. Alexander himself would cheerlead from the rear. 3 key factors shaped this front. 1. Polish recruits. In our timeline, they supplied 100,000 raw men, about a fifth of Napoleon's invasion force in 1812. Here, with their homeland directly threatened, that number could easily double. 2. Bernadotte. Stuck in Prussian garrisons, he couldn't hold forever. Overshadowed by Napoleon, people forget Bernadotte was one of the era's heavyweights. Easily a top 5 figure. Would he march to Poland to block Russia, head west to fight German defectors with fresh troops from France and the Low Countries, or most dramatically, defect, adding 70,000 regulars to the coalition? 3. Disease. There's that meme that says don't invade Russia in the winter, but Napoleon and Hitler both struck during the summer. The real killer in 1812 was Polish typhoid. As the Grand Armée camped in June, disease ripped through its ranks, killing tens of thousands. In this timeline, the Russians are the ones instead marching into the same plague-ridden lands at the same time. The army is smaller, and the Russian cold makes it worse, but the effect still balances the scales. So the outcome I'm going with here? Well, if Bernadotte joins Poland, the French win. If he heads west, there's a stalemate, and if he defects, Poland gets squeezed in a Prussian-Russia pincer. Besides these 2 theaters, which will be resolved by 1814, the other 2 blitz categories are Germany and Egypt, both of which I will cover in more depth in the director's cut. Here, France has its thickest supply lines, plus a fresh new army playing whack-a-mole with defecting princes and British expeditionary forces. Considering it's not long after Napoleon battered the Germans, and the fact that the Dover garrison took a heavy toll on the Brits, it's easy to see who is the A side here. Wellington and his navy would try to create an alternate version of the Peninsular War. Economically, France would be reeling, but at least in the short term, all of Germany would be firmly in the blue camp by late 1813. The only question here is if Napoleon's brother will decide to set an example by dismantling Berlin or otherwise severely humiliating Prussia. And then there's Egypt. Oh boy. It's inevitable Napoleon himself tries to secure his prize. And while marching 50,000 men across the Sinai is borderline madness, if anyone's gonna attempt it, it's him. Realistically, there's a good chance disease or heat stroke claims Napoleon here, resetting the timeline closer to ours. But his plot armor was famously thick. Toulon, the Revolution, the Egyptian campaign, Marengo, the coup of 1799, Polish typhoid, the Russian winter, the 100 Days, he walked away from all of them. Actually, if you made it this far, go ahead and drop a comment on who you would think had the thickest plot armor between Alexander, Caesar, and Napoleon. That sure isn't gonna cause a shit show in the comments. So let's say he survives the desert and Ottoman raids. Given enough time, he would bulldoze his way to the Bosphorus, or bargain his way there with promises of Ottoman land. That puts him in Greece, and trapped again. Short of an M. Night Shyamalan twist where a Greek fishing boat smuggles him back to Marseille, there's no way he returns in time for the main action. And Napoleon knew it. For all his recklessness, he was still a strategist, and the best thing he could do for the war effort was stay alive and prevent a succession crisis. And now for the shortened version of the Latin American theaters. Alright, so Spain loses Mexico to Miguel Hidalgo. Spain loses Argentina to José de San Martín. Spain loses Chile to Bernardo O'Higgins. Pedro I of Portugal rallies in Brazil in defiance to its Spanish occupiers. And obviously Spain loses Venezuela, Colombia, Panama, Ecuador, and Peru to Simón Bolívar. With an even bigger commitment to the coalition than in our timeline, all those rebellions that happened in our timeline are now even more of a landslide. But hey, at least Spain still has Cuba and Puerto Rico. And just like that, All roads lead back to Uncle Sam and his own pocket war, the War of 1812. The first year looks much like the same in our timeline. The weakened, but even more aggressive British Empire throws itself into the fight, only to see Spanish Florida gobbled up almost immediately. Up north, Tecumseh joins the fray, cementing his place as another unique stick figure I will have to draw. But let's be real, he earned it. The problem for Britain is that it's hard to rally men with God save king and country when the king is mad and the country itself was lost a few years ago. Worse still, London neglects Canada, whose settlers start realizing that these Yankee captains might not be half bad. And before any Canadians get mad at me, this is still alternate history, so, you know. On the water, American frigates steal the show. The USS Constitution sinks a few ships, and the USS United States captures HMS Macedonian. These shocks against Britain electrify Quebec's French Canadians, who are sick of British rule, and win grudging respect from Upper Canada's farmers. The White House stands tall. No British torches this time. Days turn into months. Months into years. By 1814, the battle lines on both sides of the Atlantic are locked in place. Despite his semi-exile in the Parthenon, Napoleon's dreams endure. Italy splits. The Vatican flips hands multiple times. Even if Poland falls, Prussia is throttled, while Germany stays blue. The Berber states of North Africa, cut loose from Ottoman control, openly harass coalition shipping. The Ottomans themselves are collapsing, losing ground to a reborn Greek kingdom. Spain folds in on itself, the Habsburgs are spent, and the world teeters on economic crisis. Napoleon, who was born in 1769, is 45 years old. The people his age got to live through the American, French, and Industrial Revolutions. This was one of, if not the, most dynamic and bloodiest period in history. The manpower pool and treasury was now empty. War exhaustion was at an all-time high, and the coalition had very little to show for it. Crucially, while having the smallest difference does make the entire timeline unstable, I can't just ignore the 1812 assassination of the British Prime Minister, who was the first and only one to ever be shot, or the death of Tecumseh the year after. In a war of attrition, with Latin America lost and Canada on the edge, the last crucial piece here is the British Raj. Britain could fight on, but only by risking an Indian powder keg. The coasts were secure, but the interior simmered with Sikhs, Marathas, and Pandaris. In our timeline, Napoleon openly mused in 1798 about marching into India from Egypt, which is quite the plan, and French envoys courted Tipur Sultan of Mysore. Knowing how paranoid London was, it's not hard to imagine a new prime minister might be forced to the table rather than risk losing India altogether, or they might just, call us bluff because that's a hell of a distance to cross. Didn't really work out for Alexander. Then you have the Eastern Front. After basically getting the Balkans and Caucasus as a gift, Emperor Alexander stabs the French so he could save Vienna, maybe take Poland, losing close to 500,000 Russians in the process. It's quite the idea. He might be bold enough to do it. There isn't a parliament. There's no polite abdication in St. Petersburg, only windows to fall out of. By 1815, Alexander's jealous brother Constantine, the biggest Napoleon fanboy of them all, stages a coup. Backed by an army that idolized him, Constantine rips the crown from his brother in a bloody purge. The year is 1815, and a victorious Napoleon hosts the Congress of Paris, attended by every major power in the Western Hemisphere. Instead of being an aggressor, however, he's now the man who got stabbed in the back, and now he's looking for retribution. The little corporal looks over Britain and demands independence for Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, alongside numerous ports and colonies for his colonial ambitions. He then looks at Spain, takes its crown, and hands it over to his brother, while gobbling up Catalonia. Next up are the Habsburgs, and he is all out of mercy. Goodbye, Empire. Hello, Hungarians and Bohemians. Instead of Westphalia, Germany is made whole, while Italy still remains a patchwork of minor kingdoms. Denmark gets Norway and Schleswig, Portugal is reinstated as a French puppet, and the Kingdom of Greece spans the Aegean Sea, towering over the Ottoman corpse. Poland is a duchy no more, now enlarged at Prussia and Russia's expense. In return, Emperor Constantine gets to keep the Balkans and all of its Slavic nations to do as he pleases. Bolivar's dream of Grand Colombia gets a high five, and President Madison's manifest destiny is fulfilled. Not only were the United States instrumental in taking over British Canada, but their market, particularly their southern cotton, is instrumental in breaking the British monopoly. Behind closed doors, ambassadors murmur of treason, hoping, praying that a stomach ulcer or something ends the Antichrist. But little do they know, the following year, all hope is lost. In case some of you are thinking, hey Cody, we get it. You're trying real hard to get Napoleon to win, but even with how the battle lines are drawn, there's no way he wins by 1814. Okay, fine. I get it. Because what comes next either seals the deal or ends Napoleon with a bang. And I do mean a bang. The Congress of Vienna might redraw Europe, could dictate foreign policy for at least the next century, but this was also the year of the Tambora eruption. The Tambora eruption of April 1850 was the most powerful volcanic explosion in recorded history. This Indonesian volcano caused the 1816 year without a summer, marked by severe global climate anomalies, with frosts, crop failures, and a famine striking Europe, North America, and Asia. Its unique effects included mass migrations, food riots, and even inspired works of art and literature such as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Turner's vivid sunset paintings. The eruption happened just as the Napoleonic Wars ended. Europe was war-weary, armies were demobilizing, and the Congress of Vienna, 1815, had already settled the big territorial disputes. But some places were hit a lot harder than others. Just think about it. The more spread out your empire is, the more multi-ethnic and diverse it is, the more potential angry mouths there are. You see, in this alternate timeline, France would be the one who's affected the least. Southern French harvests were among the ones who were left kind of unaffected. Spain and Britain heavily relied on food imports, Germany was hit the hardest, and Russia was just unprepared for such a sudden post-war famine. While France temporarily lacked access to silk, coffee, dyes, and cotton, what they still had was food. And in this alternate timeline, they're also in charge of infrastructure. Same goes for the United States, which was extremely agrarian in 1815, with close to 80% of its population living on farms. In this post-eruption world, they would be doing alright, while Mexico and Canada would be at their knees, begging for grain. Battles do come and go, but events such as these make the ink dry. What I'm talking about here is that if Napoleon had just kept it going a little bit longer, he might have won, like all of it, because of events completely outside his control. As hard as this idea is for everyone to believe, Napoleon's artillery could conquer the world, but mainly because his grain keeps it and his dynasty solidifies it. Thanks to all the patrons and members who made this possible. I honestly wouldn't be able to ramp up production, which I'm glad didn't go unnoticed. This is Cody of Alternate History Hub.